2 weeks before my wedding, I believed my life had finally chosen to be kind to me. Every ribbon was placed with intention, every detail measured and aligned just the way I designed spaces for a living. I'm Jenna Carter, an interior designer who built everything through discipline, not luck. I thought love could be protected the same way. Then my younger sister walked in with something to confess. And in a single breath, the life I had arranged so carefully began to collapse in ways I never saw coming. That Sunday afternoon felt ordinary in the quietest way. I was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by swatches of linen and handwritten seating charts, double-checking the final details like I always did. Order had always calmed me. If everything was measured, aligned, balanced, nothing could fall apart. Then Madison walked in. She didn't slam the door or call out my name the way she usually did. She just stood there for a moment, like she was testing whether the room could hold what she had brought into it. When she finally sat across from me, the air shifted. I remember noticing how pale she looked, how her hands wouldn't stay still. "There's something you should know before the wedding," she said. Before the wedding, the words felt harmless at first. I thought maybe she had lost the bridesmaid shoes or broken up with another boyfriend and wanted sympathy. Something small, something survivable. Then she said Ethan's name, and my heart misfired. She didn't cry at first. She spoke in this steady, almost rehearsed tone. She said it had only happened once. She said it was a mistake. She said she didn't mean for it to go that far. Each sentence landed gently, almost politely, as if she were confessing to borrowing a dress without asking. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to say she was joking, waiting for the version of reality I understood to come back. But it didn't. It didn't mean anything, she whispered, finally letting her voice shake. "I'm so sorry." I remember thinking how strange it was that she was apologizing to me for something that had already rearranged my entire life. In a matter of seconds, the future I had built so carefully felt like glass under pressure. When I told my parents, we all gathered in the living room. The same room where we'd celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings. The same room where they had once told me how proud they were. Ethan stood near the door, eyes fixed on the floor, like a child waiting to be scolded. He murmured apologies that sounded memorized. "I messed up. I don't know what I was thinking. I never meant to hurt you. Never meant to hurt me." As if intention could undo consequence. Before I could even process his words, my mother stepped in. She sat beside Madison on the couch and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, rubbing her back the way she used to when Madison scraped her knee as a child. "She's young," Mom said softly. "She didn't mean to hurt you, young." Madison was old enough to understand what a fiancé meant, old enough to understand what a sister meant. But in that room, she became fragile, forgivable, protected. I felt myself shrinking as they spoke. Dad sat in his armchair with the newspaper open, though the page never turned. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Ethan. He just stared at the print as if the words there were safer than the ones in the room. Silence can be louder than shouting. His silence felt like a verdict. Ethan tried again. It was a mistake. It won't ever happen again. Won't ever happen again. The phrase hung there absurd and meaningless. My wedding was in 2 weeks. There was no again. There was only what had already been done. The room grew smaller with every breath. I realized something in that moment that hurt more than the confession itself. The betrayal wasn't just between Madison and Ethan. It was unfolding in real time around me, and who was being comforted and who was being asked to understand. Mom kept speaking about forgiveness, about family, about not ruining everything over one bad decision. Her words were gentle, but they pressed against me like hands, guiding me toward acceptance I had not chosen. "Don't make this harder for everyone," she added quietly. For everyone. I wanted to ask who everyone was. I wanted to ask where I fit into that equation. But I already knew the answer. I was the disruption. The one who could either swallow it quietly or make it inconvenient. I looked at Ethan then, the man I was supposed to marry, the man I had trusted with my future. He still couldn't meet my eyes. That was the moment something inside me went still. I slipped the engagement ring off my finger. I remember noticing how light my hand suddenly felt. How strange it was that such a small piece of metal could hold so much illusion. No one spoke as I placed it on the coffee table. The sound it made against the wood was barely audible, but it cut through the room like a crack in glass. Mom inhaled sharply. Madison started crying harder. Dad lowered the newspaper slightly, just enough to see. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse, because the truth was already sitting there between us. I walked toward the door, each step steady though my chest felt hollow. No one tried to stop me at first. Maybe they thought I just needed air. Maybe they believed I would come back inside once I'd calmed down. But as I reached the threshold, I understood something I had never wanted to believe. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's delivered gently, defended softly, and wrapped in the language of family. I opened the door, stepped into the fading light of evening, and walked out. And that night, I didn't look back. The next morning, sunlight forced its way through the blinds like it had somewhere to be. I hadn't slept. My phone had been ringing for hours before I finally answered. It was Mom. Her voice was steady, almost calm. Too calm. She said we needed to talk, that we should handle this like adults, as if betrayal could be scheduled and resolved between breakfast and lunch. I didn't want to go back to that house, but some part of me still hoped stupidly that there was room for me there, that maybe overnight something had shifted. When I walked in, Madison was already on the couch, a blanket draped around her shoulders, tissues scattered at her feet. She looked small, fragile, like the wounded one. "I didn't mean to ruin your life," she said, her voice trembling in all the right places. The words sounded polished, practiced, like she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror until they felt convincing enough. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice not to break, not from sadness, but from disbelief. Mom sat beside her, rubbing her back again, repeating that everyone makes mistakes, that this didn't have to destroy the family, that love meant forgiveness. Dad was in his usual chair, newspaper open again, the same page, the same silence. He muttered something about not making things worse, as if the worst thing happening in that room would be my reaction. Ethan stood in the corner, hands clasped in front of him. He apologized again, but it sounded thinner than it had the night before, like a script read too many times without conviction. Before I could even ask a question, Mom spoke for him. "He feels terrible, Jenna. Don't make it harder for anyone. There it was again. Anyone. I stood there and realized something sharp and undeniable. I hadn't been invited to speak. I had been invited to comply, to smooth it over, to nod quietly and allow the narrative to settle into something comfortable. Madison cried again. Mom told her she was too young to understand the consequences of what she'd done. Too young. No one mentioned that I was the one getting married in 2 weeks. No one asked how I felt waking up to a future that no longer existed. They spoke about forgiveness like it was mandatory, like it was the price of staying. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my ribs. I suddenly understood that if I stayed in that room long enough, I would be absorbed into their version of events, the one where this was a mistake, not a betrayal. The one where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. You already did, I said quietly when Madison whispered that she hadn't meant to ruin everything. The room went silent. Not shocked, not ashamed, just inconvenienced. I walked upstairs without asking permission, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and started packing. I didn't overthink it. A few clothes, my laptop, my sketchbook, the essentials. Madison followed me halfway up the stairs, her voice shaking as she asked me to wait, to talk, to understand. But I had understood enough. When I closed the suitcase, it felt like sealing something far larger than fabric and zippers. I was closing the version of myself that kept trying to belong in a room that didn't protect her. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against my skin, but I felt cold. Completely cold. I drove until the houses thinned out and pulled into a gas station near the edge of town. My hands were steady when I called Chloe. She arrived without questions. She looked at me once, really looked, and didn't ask for details. She didn't ask what I was going to do next. She just said, "Go." Don't wait for anyone to apologize. They never will. There was something grounding about the simplicity of that. No speeches about family, no pressure to forgive. Just clarity. We loaded the last of my things into her car. I didn't glance back at the house. I didn't wait for a call. As we drove away, I opened my phone and started deleting. Contacts, messages, photos, every thread that tied me to them. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears sliding down my cheeks. Just a quiet, deliberate choice. If they had already decided the story without me, then I would remove myself from it entirely. I chose silence over pleading, and for the first time, I stopped waiting for someone to choose me back. 2 months passed in a blur of quiet survival. I was staying on Chloe's couch, moving through my days like someone who had misplaced her own reflection. I told myself I didn't need updates. I didn't care what they were doing. I had already walked away. Then one night, a notification slipped through. A mutual friend had posted something. I had forgotten to unfollow. I clicked without thinking, and my body went completely still. There they were, Madison and Ethan standing at the altar in the exact garden I had booked. The same white rose arch I had chosen after weeks of comparing arrangements. The same aisle lined with ivory chairs. Even the sunlight looked familiar, like it had been reserved. For a second, my brain refused to process it. It felt like looking at a distorted memory, like someone had taken a photograph from my future and edited me out. Madison wore a gown almost identical to the one I had tried on in front of Mom months earlier. I could still remember standing on that little platform, watching my mother wipe her eyes, believing they were tears of joy. Ethan stood beside her with an easy smile, relaxed, unburdened. The caption beneath the photo read, "A family reunited." My parents stood proudly on either side of them, smiling at the camera as if this was the ending everyone had hoped for. Mom was wearing the same dress I had bought her for my wedding day. I had imagined helping her zip it up, imagined taking a photo together before walking down the aisle. Now she was standing beside my sister. I stared at the screen until everything blurred. The comments were filled with words like true love, fate's second chances, people celebrating something that had been carved out of my life. My wedding had not been canceled. It had been reassigned. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped something out and left the space open. But the worst part hadn't even arrived yet. I closed the photos and opened my banking app. The deposits for the venue, the photographer's retainer, the catering payment, gone. Each transaction led to the same updated account. The booking hadn't been canceled. It had simply been transferred. The new name attached to the contract read, Mrs. Madison Brooks. Mrs.? My stomach dropped so suddenly I had to sit down. I called the venue manager, my voice steady in a way that didn't match how I felt. I asked if there had been a mistake. There hadn't. They explained that the event had been updated under a new name. Same date, same services. The paperwork had been adjusted accordingly. Adjusted? As if my existence in that plan had been a clerical error. I ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Every detail I had agonized over, every decision I had made with care and excitement, it had all been absorbed into her life. They hadn't just taken Ethan, they had taken the venue, the flowers, the photographer, the deposits, the future I had saved for. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was erasure. My apartment felt different after that. Smaller. The boxes of decorations stacked in the corner didn't look like hope anymore. They looked like leftovers from a story that no longer belonged to me. For days, I barely moved. The walls seemed to close in heavy with lists and fabric samples and sketches of table settings that had already been used. Used by her. Eventually, I stood in the center of the living room and realized I couldn't breathe there anymore. The space held too many versions of me. The one who believed in loyalty. The one who trusted her family to protect her. I needed a place that didn't remember, so I made a decision that felt both painful and necessary. I listed the apartment for sale. Letting it go felt like cutting off the last physical tie to the life I had planned. But staying would have meant reliving that wedding in my mind every time I walked past those empty corners. They had rewritten my day. They had rewritten my name on the contract. But they weren't going to rewrite my entire life. If I couldn't reclaim what they had taken, I would build something they could never touch. And this time it would belong entirely to me. I didn't choose Cleveland because it was glamorous. I chose it because it was quiet. The house I found on the east side wasn't impressive. The floors creaked in certain corners. The walls had thin cracks that ran like faint scars from ceiling to baseboard. The porch leaned slightly to one side as if it had grown tired of holding itself upright. But it was affordable, and more importantly, it was mine. The first night I slept there, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. There were no wedding samples stacked in the corner. No unopened invitations, no ghosts of what should have been, just empty rooms and the soft hum of distant traffic outside. The silence felt different than it had at Chloe's apartment. This wasn't the silence of shock, it was a silence of possibility. I started small, a second-hand desk by the window, a lamp with warm light instead of harsh white. I patched the cracks in the walls myself, sanding them down until the surface felt smooth beneath my palm. There was something grounding about it, repairing something visible, watching it respond to care. I returned to freelance interior design work slowly, almost cautiously. I emailed old contacts, took on small projects, living rooms, home offices, modest renovations. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep moving. During the day, I met clients with a professionalism that surprised even me. I spoke about color palettes and spatial flow with steady confidence. I made recommendations, drew sketches, sent invoices. At night, when the house was quiet again, the ache would creep back in. I'd sit at my desk, surrounded by fabric swatches and sample board, and sometimes my mind would drift to that garden, that arch of white roses. But instead of collapsing under it, I kept working. Chloe visited most weekends. She'd show up with coffee and a bag of pastries, acting as if driving 2 hours was nothing. She never pushed me to talk about Madison or Ethan. She didn't treat me like I was fragile. One Saturday, while we were hanging curtains in the living room, she looked at me and said, "Rebuilding doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're still here." Still here. It sounded simple, but it shifted something inside me. We'd laugh over crooked curtain rods and debate paint shades, like it was the most important decision in the world. In those small, ordinary moments, I felt something steady returning. Not joy exactly, but balance. Work began to fill the house. Sketches covered the dining table. Fabric samples spilled across the couch. My laptop stayed open late into the night while I adjusted layouts and sent proposals. I'd lose track of time, absorbed in the precision of it all. Design had always been about creating order from chaos. Now it felt personal. Every client who trusted me with their space felt like quiet validation. Every payment that landed in my account felt like a brick, placed carefully back into the foundation of my life. The house started to change too. Plants appeared on the windowsills. A rug softened the living room floor. The kitchen table became a place for ideas instead of reminders. The rooms no longer echoed when I walked through them. They felt lived in. One evening, while finishing a layout for a client's bedroom redesign, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. For a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked tired, but she also looked steady. They had taken my wedding, my plans, even my money, but they hadn't taken my hands, my mind, my ability to create something beautiful out of empty space. That realization didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Over time, the sharpness of the pain dulled. It didn't vanish. It just softened into something manageable. Something that no longer dictated my every thought. Cleveland began to feel less like exile and more like choice. My business was still small. My name wasn't printed on glossy magazines or high-end brochures, but every client was mine. Every project was mine. Every late night at that desk by the window was building something that belonged entirely to me. For the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel like I was just surviving the wreckage. I felt capable, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because it no longer defined the shape of my future. About a year after I moved to Cleveland, something shifted again, but this time it wasn't loss, it was opportunity. An email landed in my inbox from a property developer looking for an interior designer to style several model homes. The kind of project I used to daydream about back when my biggest concern was centerpieces and seating charts. It felt bigger than anything I'd taken on since starting over. To make it official, I needed to sign a formal business contract. That's how I met Daniel Hayes. He was introduced by a colleague. Thorough patient doesn't rush, they had said. I didn't expect much beyond competence. I certainly wasn't looking for anything personal. Our first meeting took place in a quiet office with tall windows and too many framed certificates on the wall. Daniel stood when I walked in, offered a firm but unassuming handshake, and greeted me with a calm professionalism that didn't feel rehearsed. He didn't flip through the contract quickly just to prove he could. He went line by line. He paused to explain clauses in plain language. He pointed out potential risks I hadn't considered. He asked if I had questions, and then actually waited for my answer. There was no impatience in him, no subtle condescension, just attention. At one point, as I adjusted my papers, his eyes briefly flicked to my left hand. The faint silver band mark was still there, barely visible, but not gone. He hesitated before asking carefully, "Do you need me to include anyone else on the contract?" The question wasn't intrusive. It wasn't loaded. It was practical. I gave a small smile. "No, just me." He nodded, once accepting that, without curiosity or pity. And in that simple exchange, something inside me relaxed. Over the next few weeks, we met often to finalize details. The project required revisions, negotiations, clarifications. Each time Daniel showed up the same way, measured, thoughtful, present. He listened when I spoke about my design vision as if it mattered beyond profit margins. He asked questions not to challenge me, but to understand. One afternoon, after a long discussion about delivery timelines, he leaned back slightly and said, almost casually, "You seem distant whenever personal topics come up." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I surprised myself by answering. I told him about Madison, about Ethan, about the wedding that became someone else's. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't cry. The story came out steady, almost detached. It was the first time I had said their names aloud in Cleveland. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Daniel looked at me and said, "You don't need closure from them. You already survived what they did." The words landed differently than anything I'd heard before. I had spent so long imagining closure as something external, an apology, a confession, an admission of guilt. But he reframed it quietly. Survival itself was evidence of strength. He didn't offer to fix my past. He didn't analyze my family or suggest revenge or forgiveness. He simply acknowledged that I was still standing. And somehow that was enough. Our meetings gradually extended beyond contracts. Sometimes we'd grab coffee after reviewing paperwork. At first, it felt incidental. Then, it became routine. He would ask about my clients, about color palettes and lighting plans with genuine curiosity. I found myself asking about his cases just to hear the way he broke down complicated problems into calm solutions. There was no rush between us. No dramatic confessions, no grand gestures. Trust formed quietly, almost imperceptibly. He never treated me like a wounded person. He treated me like a capable one. The model homes turned out beautifully. When the project was complete, I stood in one of the finished spaces, sunlight pouring through clean windows, furniture arranged with intention, and realized something had changed. I no longer felt like a woman recovering from betrayal. I felt like a woman building something new. Daniel visited my house one evening to drop off the final contract documents. We stood in my kitchen laughing about a minor construction mishap from the project, the kind that once would have stressed me beyond reason. "You've done more than rebuild a business," he said lightly. "You've rebuilt yourself." This time I didn't deflect the compliment, because he was right. The house no longer felt like a refuge from pain. It felt like home. My work was steady. My days had rhythm. And beside me was someone who didn't demand explanations or apologies from my past. Daniel and I built something steady, not perfect, not rushed, just rooted in respect and patience. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to choose me. I had already chosen myself. 4 years passed before my mother called. Her voice trembled as she said her health hadn't been steady, that she wanted to see me, that maybe it was time for dinner together. The word "together" felt fragile in her mouth, like something she wasn't sure she had the right to say. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Daniel offered to come with me. Not to confront anyone, not to argue, just to be there. He said closure doesn't always arrive on its own. You sometimes have to walk toward it. The night we drove up to my parents' house, the porch light was still flickering the same way it always had. The curtains in the window hadn't changed. It was unsettling how normal everything looked, as if 4 years hadn't existed. Inside, I heard laughter before we reached the dining room. When I stepped in, Madison was already seated beside Ethan. Between them sat a little boy with bright curls and wide eyes, pushing a toy car back and forth across the table. Liam. For a second, I just stood there absorbing the scene. They looked like a family portrait, composed, finished. Mom rushed forward with a smile that tried too hard. "I'm so glad you came," she said, ushering Daniel and me to our seats as if we were late to something ordinary. Dad nodded from his chair, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. Dinner began with stiff politeness. Small talk about work, about the weather, about Liam's school. Madison described her new house and mentioned a recent promotion like she was listing achievements for an audience. Then she looked at me. "Some of us moved on," she said lightly, a smile curving her lips in a way that wasn't kind. The words landed, but they didn't cut the way she expected. 4 years earlier, I would have felt heat rise in my chest. I would have scrambled for something sharp to say back. But now I felt something steadier. Daniel's hand found mine beneath the table, not squeezing, just resting there. A reminder. I asked my mother how she'd been feeling, trying to shift the focus. She sighed and said she just wanted us to be a family again. As if family were something that could be restored by pretending the fracture never happened. Ethan cleared his throat, nodding in agreement. Dad finally spoke, his voice firm in a way it never had been when it mattered. "Let's not make this worse. As if honesty were the threat. Something inside me settled then. Not cracked, not exploded, settled. I looked around the table at the people who had once defined my world. The same faces, the same patterns, the same instinct to protect comfort over truth. "You wanted peace," I said, calmly, my voice steady in the quiet room. "But peace doesn't come from pretending the past didn't happen." Madison rolled her eyes. "You're still bitter. We're happy now. You should try that." I turned to her, not with anger, but with clarity. Happiness built on lies doesn't last, I said. One day, Liam will grow up and see exactly who you both are. The room went silent. Ethan's expression stiffened. Dad inhaled sharply as if preparing to argue, but Daniel spoke first. She has nothing more to explain. He said, his tone even. You don't invite someone to dinner just to remind them of their pain. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Please don't leave angry, she whispered. I stood slowly. I'm not angry, I said, and I realized it was true. I'm done. There was no shaking in my voice, no dramatic exit, just a finality that felt clean. I looked at each of them, my sister, my father, my mother, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not hatred, distance. You're not my family anymore, I said softly. It wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary. Daniel stood beside me without hesitation. We walked toward the door together, the sound of our steps echoing faintly behind us. No one followed. Outside, the night air felt colder than when we'd arrived, but it also felt lighter, like something heavy had finally been set down. As we reached the car, Daniel opened the door for me and waited until I was seated before walking around to his side. He didn't say much, just, you did what you needed to do. I looked back once at the house, the porch light still flickering, the curtains still drawn. For years I had imagined that moment filled with shouting or tears, some dramatic release. Instead, it felt quiet, and as we drove away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Jenna didn't plan to write it. The idea came quietly on a rain-heavy afternoon when Daniel was at the office and the house felt too still. She'd been sorting through old design files when she found the original wedding proposal, the one with the soft ivory draping the handwritten vows framed in walnut, the reception lighting timed to fade into gold, the wedding that had never been hers. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she began. She didn't use names, she didn't mention cities. She changed small details just enough to blur the edges, but she kept the truth intact. She wrote about a sister who wore another woman's dress, about parents who called theft a misunderstanding, about love that was replaced in secret and presented as destiny. She wrote about sitting alone in an apartment paid for with savings, meant for a shared future, scrolling through photos of a ceremony she had financed flowers, chosen by her music, selected by her deposits, transferred under someone else's name. She wrote about humiliation that doesn't scream but seeps, about betrayal that doesn't explode but erases. The words poured out faster than she expected. She didn't soften them. She didn't dramatize them. She simply told the truth as she had lived it. When she finished, she read it once, then twice. Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. You survived. You don't owe anyone a performance of pain. She created a new account. No photo, no history. Just a blank space and a story titled, "My Sister Married My Fiancé in the Wedding I Paid For." She posted it to a popular personal essay forum, and then she closed the laptop. By morning, it had tens of thousands of views. By afternoon, hundreds of comments. By the second day, it had gone viral. Strangers dissected every line. They expressed outrage. They offered sympathy. Some shared their own stories of betrayal and family silence. The internet did what it always did: magnified, speculated, devoured. Jenna hadn't expected it to spread so far. She had imagined a quiet corner of validation, not a tidal wave. But the details were too specific. Someone recognized the venue description. Someone else remembered Madison's wedding photos posted publicly, tagged widely. A third person compared timelines. Within a week, the story had a name attached to it. Her name and theirs. The fallout was swift. Madison worked in a marketing firm that prided itself on brand integrity. Clients began emailing questions. Screenshots of the article circulated in group chats. The firm placed her on administrative leave first. Then they let her go. Ethan, who taught at a private preparatory school, was suspended pending conduct review. Parents questioned his ethics. The administration cited reputational concerns. Jenna's mother, who had long positioned herself as a pillar in the local church community, was quietly removed from her leadership role. The church issued a statement about personal matters inconsistent with our values of transparency and accountability. The house that had once hummed with curated normalcy became silent under scrutiny. Her phone began to buzz again after years of stillness. Missed calls, unknown numbers. A voicemail from her father that said, "Only, how could you do this to your own family?" Jenna didn't respond. She hadn't written the article to punish them. At least that's what she told herself. She sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through headlines and comment threads, watching strangers argue over her life like it was serialized fiction. There was no thrill in it, no rush, no sense of justice landing cleanly, just a hollow widening space. Daniel found her there that evening, staring at the screen. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. He read a few lines over her shoulder, then closed the laptop gently. "They made their choices," he said. "I didn't name them. You didn't have to." She expected to feel vindicated, to feel seen in a way she hadn't before. Instead, she felt tired. Madison losing her job didn't restore her stolen wedding. Ethan's suspension didn't return the years she'd spent rebuilding herself. Her mother stepping down from church leadership didn't undo the silence at that dinner table 4 years ago. Consequences were happening, but they weren't healing. "I thought it would feel different," Jenna admitted. Daniel studied her carefully. "Revenge never stops where you think it will." She frowned slightly. "It spreads," he continued. "It pulls in people who weren't in the room when it started. It doesn't ask whether you're ready for what comes next." Outside, the Cleveland sky was darkening into evening. The house she had built slowly, brick by brick of resilience, felt smaller somehow. She had told the truth, and the truth had burned. But the ashes weren't satisfying. They were just heavy. Her phone buzzed again on the table. This time she didn't even look at it. For the first time since the article went live, she wondered whether silence might have been stronger. Not for them, for her. The noise didn't fade quickly. It thinned, then lingered, then settled into something colder. Ethan was the first to leave. At first, it was rumors. Separate cars, deleted photos, no anniversary post. Then a quiet confirmation through a mutual acquaintance he'd moved out. No dramatic statement, no defense, just distance. Whatever had once bound him to Madison, impulse, pride, shared secrecies hadn't survived public scrutiny. Suspension became resignation. Resignation became relocation. He took a teaching position in another state, somewhere small enough that no one immediately recognized his name. Madison stayed, but she shrank. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The women who had once praised her wedding decor now crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Online comments followed her like shadows. Even silence felt accusatory. She'd built a life on a story that had unraveled in daylight. And then there was Liam. Jenna hadn't thought about the children when she wrote the article. She hadn't pictured school hallways or whispered cruelty. But children hear things. They repeat things. Liam was teased, asked why his dad left, why his mom stole someone else's wedding, why his grandmother wasn't allowed to lead prayer anymore. Cruelty travels easily. One evening, weeks after the story's peak, Jenna found an envelope in her mailbox. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. Her mother's. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it. The letter wasn't defensive. It wasn't accusatory. It was tired. Her mother wrote about isolation, about shame, about watching her grandson come home from school quieter than before, about sitting in church pews instead of standing at the podium. She didn't deny what had happened. She didn't rewrite it. She wrote only this: I don't know how to fix what we broke. I don't know how to fix what you broke in return. I am asking for peace. Not forgiveness, just peace. Jenna read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully. Daniel found her later that night staring at nothing. I didn't think about Liam, she said softly. He didn't rush to reassure her. That's the thing about pain, he replied. It rarely stays contained. She opened her laptop. The article was still there. Archived, shared, dissected, but still hers to control. Thousands of comments, thousands of echoes. She scrolled through the words she had written in fury, disguised as honesty. They were true. Every line was true, but truth had become a weapon in her hands. Her finger hovered over the settings. Delete. A confirmation box appeared. She didn't hesitate this time. Click. The page vanished. It wouldn't erase screenshots. It wouldn't erase consequences already set in motion. But it was the first choice she'd made that wasn't about proving something. When the screen refreshed, she felt it subtle but real. Lighter, not triumphant. Not absolved, unhooked. She walked to the window and watched the evening settle over Cleveland. The sky was soft, unbothered by human reckoning. Justice, she realized, had been about acknowledgement, about refusing to carry shame that wasn't hers. Peace was different. Peace didn't require witnesses. Peace didn't need consequences. Justice had exposed them, but peace released her. For the first time in years, she understood the difference. Jenna moved again the following spring. Not far, just far enough. A smaller town along the lake. Quieter streets. Fewer echoes. The kind of place where mornings arrived gently and no one knew her history unless she chose to tell it. She rented a narrow brick building with tall front windows and uneven hardwood floors. It needed work. She liked that. Daniel helped her. Carrying the drafting table, the fabric samples, the old walnut frame she'd once designed for vows that were never spoken. He didn't ask if she was running away. He understood that this wasn't escape. It was alignment. The night before the studio opened, she left a letter on the kitchen counter. Not a goodbye, a boundary. She wrote that she loved him, but she needed to know she could stand fully on her own. That partnership meant more when it was chosen freely, not leaned on for steadiness. That she wanted to build something that was hers, without any shadow of rescue attached to it. Daniel didn't argue. He never had been the kind of man who mistook space for rejection. He told her he would be where she left him. Steady, not gripping. The studio opened quietly. No ribbon cutting. No announcement beyond a simple brass sign. J. Carter Design. Clients came slowly at first, then steadily. She designed reading nooks and small cafes, lake houses, and therapy offices, spaces meant for beginning again. One afternoon, a familiar envelope arrived at the studio. Madison's handwriting this time. Jenna held it for a long moment before opening it. The letter was shorter than their mother's had been. It didn't defend. It didn't explain. It simply acknowledged harm. It spoke of loneliness, of therapy, of understanding too late what envy had cost. There was no request for reunion, only a line at the end. I hope you found what I tried to take. Jenna folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beneath her desk. She didn't respond, not out of cruelty, not out of pride, but because there was nothing left to say. Forgiveness, she had once believed, was something she owed to be free. Now she understood something quieter. She had never forgiven them. She had simply stopped needing to. On evenings when the lake turned silver and the studio lights glowed warm against the dark, Jenna would sit alone in the stillness she had built. No vindication, no rehearsed speeches, just breath. Just space, just a life no longer shaped by what had been taken, but by what she chose to create. Justice can return what was taken. It gives you back your voice, your footing, your sense of control. But peace is different. Peace is the quiet decision to stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. If this story felt familiar, if you've known betrayal and found your own way forward, you're not alone. Share your thoughts if you'd like. And if stories like this matter to you, staying connected helps us keep telling them.